The palace trembled. Not with earthquakes or explosions, but with something far worse. The ancient walls bled black light, dripping like living ink down the marble corridors that had witnessed 300 years of history. 500 nobles fell to their knees simultaneously, not by choice, but because something primordial, something older than civilization itself, had just awakened beneath their feet. And in the center of the throne room, surrounded by shattered glass and guards paralyzed with terror, stood her, Seraphina Umbravox. Her silver eyes blazed with an intensity that made the torches around flicker and die, one by one, until only the ghostly light emanating from her own body illuminated the scene. 35 voices echoed simultaneously from her throat, each screaming a different name, each demanding a different form of justice. The Shadow King Aldrich stood before her, his obsidian crown reflecting that supernatural light, and for the first time in 3 years of tormented reign, he didn't look like a tyrant. He looked like a desperate man trying to prevent the apocalypse he himself had caused. But to understand how we arrived at this moment of absolute horror, we need to go back 3 years, back to the night when everything burned. Hello, I'm Tamina, and this is another story from our channel. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this content, please subscribe to the channel so this story reaches more people. Leave your like, share, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Remember, this is a completely fictional story, created for entertainment. Now, let's dive into this dark journey that will change everything you think you know about revenge, sacrifice, and the true price of power. The Umbravox Manor stood in Ashwick Valley, a property that existed since before the Kingdom of Thornwick itself had a name. It was more than a house. It was a living monument to the oldest and most mysterious lineage that ever served the crown. The Umbravox weren't common nobles. They didn't accumulate wealth or dispute political power. Their function was different, much more important, and infinitely more dangerous. They were the Shadow Guardians, a secret order that existed for a single reason: to keep imprisoned the thing that slept beneath the royal palace, the Shadow Devourer. An entity so ancient that the first kings of Thornwick found it already asleep, sealed by magic from a civilization that didn't even leave ruins to tell its story. The kingdom's founders, wise enough to recognize that some evils cannot be destroyed, only contained, built their palace directly over the prison, and summoned the Umbravox, a family whose silver eyes carried the supernatural ability to see through any lie, any illusion, any disguise, to be the eternal guardians of the magical seals that kept the shadow imprisoned. For 300 years, each generation, the Umbravox renewed the seals. It was a complex ritual that required the presence of the entire family, their combined energies, their shared blood, working in unison to reinforce the invisible chains that bound something that fed on corruption, lies, and innocent blood. And for 300 years, the system worked perfectly, until Seraphina's generation. She was 19 years old on the night of the renewal ceremony. She was the oldest of 7 siblings, all marked with the characteristic silver eyes of their lineage. Her youngest brother, Damien, was only 7 years old and was participating in his first ceremony, a moment of pride for the entire family. 35 members of the Umbravox clan were gathered in the manor's great hall. Uncles, aunts, cousins, grandparents, all connected by blood and purpose. The ritual candles were lit. The ancestral chants echoed through the stone walls. Magic flowed through them like an invisible river, guided by the experienced hands of the patriarch, Lord Edmund Umbravox, Seraphina's father. Everything was progressing exactly as it had for 3 centuries, until the doors exploded inward. The Crimson Fangs entered like a storm of steel and fire. 50 elite warriors, black armor reflecting the ritual candlelight, transforming the sacred hall into a nightmare of dancing shadows and gleaming metal. They didn't shout warnings, didn't make proclamations, simply attacked. Commander Vorath Thorn led the charge, his sword already stained with blood from the outer guards who tried to prevent the invasion. Behind him, a hooded figure watched with barely disguised satisfaction. Gregor, the royal advisor. The man who had served 3 generations of kings. The man everyone trusted. Seraphina saw her father rise, his hands still glowing with ritual energy, confusion and horror, fighting for space on his face. He opened his mouth to speak, to ask, to try to understand what was happening. The arrow pierced his throat before any sound could emerge. Blood sprayed in a crimson arc, splashing the ritual circle, contaminating the magic that flowed through it. And in that moment, something went terribly wrong. The ritual magic wasn't simply interrupted. It exploded. 300 years of accumulated power, generations of energy carefully woven into the seals, all shattered at once. The shockwave threw half the crimson fangs against the walls, made the windows explode outward in a rain of colored glass. And in the center of the chaos, Seraphina felt something impossible happen. The souls of her family, violently released from their bodies by the magical collapse, unable to pass to the beyond due to the interrupted nature of the ritual, were pulled to the only available anchor. To her, who was in the center of the circle? Who was at the epicenter of the magical explosion? Who was alive when everyone else was dying? 35 souls merged with hers in a single moment of transcendent agony. She felt each one of them. Felt her mother, Vivienne, trying to protect her even in death. Felt her father, Edmund, screaming warnings she couldn't understand. Felt her twin sisters, Alara and Miriam, crying with fear and confusion. Felt Damien, her baby brother, calling for her in panic. Felt all of them, all their memories, all their fears, all their desperate last thoughts, pouring into her mind like a tsunami of alien consciousness. Seraphina screamed, not with one voice, but with 36. The sound was so unnatural, so wrong, that even the crimson fangs hesitated. Gregor took a step back, his eyes wide not with fear, but with something far worse. Recognition, satisfaction, as if this was exactly what he expected to happen. Vorath shouted orders for his men to finish the job, but the fire had already begun. Incendiary arrows fired during the initial attack had hit the ancient tapestries. The flames spread with supernatural speed, fed by the uncontrolled magic still pulsing in the air. The ceiling began to collapse. 300-year-old wooden beams, dry as bones, broke and fell like flaming spears. Vorath made a decision. He grabbed Gregor and shouted the retreat. The crimson fangs withdrew, leaving behind an inferno that would consume any evidence of their presence, leaving behind 35 bodies, and a girl who was no longer just a girl, but something the world hadn't seen in centuries. A corrupted guardian. Seraphina didn't remember how she escaped. The 35 voices in her head screamed contradictory instructions. Her mother begged her to run. Her father demanded she stay and fight. Her sisters cried without stopping. Her uncle Marcus, always the strategist, analyzed escape routes with military coldness. Her aunt Helena, paranoid even in death, saw betrayal in every shadow. And Damien, her baby brother, just cried and called for her, not understanding that he was dead, that everyone was dead, that only she had survived to carry the weight of their fragmented souls. When Seraphina finally regained consciousness, 3 days had passed. She was lying in the smoking ruins of what had been her home. Ashes covered everything like dirty snow. The smell of burned flesh still hung in the air, sweet and nauseating. And the voices. The voices never stopped. She tried to stand and immediately fell. Her feet were burned, the skin raw where she'd stepped on still hot embers during her unconscious escape. Her hands were stained black, not with soot, but with something deeper, something that seemed to have penetrated her own skin, and her eyes. When she found a mirror fragment among the debris and looked at her reflection, Seraphina saw that her silver eyes were no longer just silver. Entire galaxies seemed to spin within them, dead stars blinking in an infinite void. But what truly terrified her wasn't her appearance. It was what she could see now. When she looked at the ruins, She didn't see just ashes and broken stone. She saw echoes, ghosts of past moments overlapping present reality. Saw her family alive, laughing, celebrating, moments before the massacre. Saw the crimson fangs invading, their auras stained with the sickly color of betrayal, and orders followed without question. Saw Gregor watching everything with eyes that gleamed with something definitely not human. And deeper, much deeper, she felt something stirring, something immense, something hungry, something that had been asleep so long it had forgotten what it was to be awake, but that now, with the seals broken, with the guardians dead, with no one to renew them, was beginning to awaken. The shadow devourer, and it was hungry from 300 years of forced fasting. Seraphina understood in that moment, with terrible clarity, that her personal revenge against the king who ordered her family's massacre was insignificant compared to what was coming. If she didn't do something, if the seals weren't renewed, that thing under the palace would awaken completely. And when it awoke, there would be no kingdom to avenge, no one alive to remember the Umbravox ever existed. A figure emerged from the tree line surrounding the ruins. Seraphina spun, the 35 voices screaming simultaneous warnings, her hands rising instinctively in a defensive posture she didn't remember learning. But it was just an old woman. Marta, the herb healer who had lived on the edge of Umbravox lands for 40 years. Her wrinkled face was pale with shock, her eyes red from crying. She carried a cloth bag containing basic supplies, food, water, bandages. Child, her voice trembled. You can't stay here. They'll return to check for survivors. You need to go. Now. Seraphina looked at the old woman with her new eyes and saw absolute truth. Marta wasn't a spy, had no hidden agendas, was just an old, frightened woman trying to save the only person left from a family she'd served for decades. The seals. Seraphina heard her own voice, but couldn't tell which of the 36 was speaking. They're broken. The prison is failing. How much time do we have? Marta stared at her without comprehension. What are you talking about, child? How much time until the thing under the palace awakens completely? The words came out with desperate urgency, 35 voices of the dead echoing through her. Marta took a step back, fear finally touching her eyes. Your eyes. What happened to your eyes? Seraphina had no time for explanations. The voices in her head, especially her father's, were calculating. The seals were renewed each generation because they gradually lost strength. With proper maintenance, they lasted 60 to 70 years. But violently broken, with no guardian to even slow the deterioration, weeks, maybe months if they were lucky, no more than that. I need to go to the Forgotten Lands, Seraphina said, her voice stabilizing as her Uncle Marcus's personality temporarily took control, bringing strategic focus to the emotional chaos. There's someone there who can teach me what I need to know. Marta shook her head violently. The Forgotten Lands are where exiles go to die. No one returns from there. Exactly, Seraphina responded, accepting the supply bag. No one will look for me in a place from which no one returns. She started to walk away, then stopped and looked back. Marta, when the king's soldiers return, tell them you found no one. Tell them all the Umbravox died in the fire. The old healer nodded slowly. And if they ask about you specifically? A smile touched Seraphina's lips, but didn't reach her eyes of dead galaxies. Tell the truth. Seraphina Umbravox died with her family. What survived is something else entirely. The Forgotten Lands deserved their name. It was a stretch of territory beyond Thornwick's eastern border, where nothing grew except twisted thorns and the kind of despair that settled in bones like winter frost. Criminals came here to disappear. Exiles came here to die. And occasionally, broken girls came here to transform into weapons. Seraphina took 6 days to cross the border, moving only at night, hiding during the day, the voices in her head constantly arguing about every decision. Her mother wanted her to rest more. Her father insisted she move faster. Her sisters were afraid of every shadow. Damien cried when she didn't eat enough. It was exhausting in ways that transcended the physical. It wasn't just her body that was tired. It was her mind, forced to house 36 different consciousnesses, all fighting for attention, all traumatized, all trapped in a body that wasn't big enough to contain them. But her uncle Marcus's voice kept her focused. He had been a military strategist before retiring to guardian life, and even in death, his tactical instincts remained sharp. He guided her through dangerous terrain, pointed out safe hiding spots, taught her to cover her tracks. It was Marcus who finally led her to the cave system. The caves were ancient, older than Thornwick, older than the Umbravox, possibly older than the Shadow Devourer itself. They deepened into the earth following veins of primordial magic that made compasses spin wildly and hunting dogs howl and refuse to follow. Seraphina felt the magic the moment she entered. It wasn't like her family's magic, refined and carefully controlled. It was wild, raw, dangerous. And inside the deepest cave, illuminated by crystals that glowed with their own light, sat a man she recognized immediately, though she'd never seen him before. Massacre Greystone, the last survivor of the massacre 60 years ago. He sat in a roughly carved stone chair, so motionless that for a moment Seraphina thought he might be dead. Then he opened his eyes, silver, exactly like hers. But where Seraphina's eyes contained galaxies, Massacre's contained only void. "You took your time," he said, his voice like stones rubbing together. "I felt the seals break 6 days ago, felt the souls merge, felt a new corrupted guardian being born." Seraphina stepped forward, the 35 voices whispering contradictory warnings. "You know what I am. I know what you're becoming," Massacre corrected. "The question is whether you'll survive long enough to complete the transformation, or if the voices will consume you first." Massacre wasn't a gentle mentor. He offered no comfort or soft words. In the following 3 years, he did only one thing. He taught Seraphina to survive the hell inside her own head. The training began immediately, not with weapons or combat, but with something much more fundamental: control. The 35 voices never stopped. They spoke simultaneously, each demanding attention, each pulling her consciousness in different directions. It was like trying to hear 35 conversations at once, while also trying to keep her own thoughts coherent. Most people would go mad in hours. Seraphina had lasted 6 days only through pure stubbornness. "You need to learn to silence them," Massacre said on the first night. "Not permanently. You can't do that without destroying parts of yourself, but temporarily. You need to learn to push them to the back of your mind when you need to think clearly." "How?" Seraphina asked, her voice desperate. "They never stop. Never." "Pain," Massacre responded simply. Then, before she could react, he hit her. Hard. Across the face with the back of his hand. Pain exploded through her cheek, and for one blessed moment, the voices stopped. Shocked by the sudden violence, stunned by the sharp physical sensation. And in that moment of silence, Seraphina managed to think one thought that was hers alone. "See?" Massacre said. "Pain distracts them. It's the only thing all 35 feel equally. Use it." The following months were the most brutal of Seraphina's life. Massacre trained her without mercy. Hand-to-hand combat that left her body covered in bruises. Weapons training that cut her hands until calluses formed. Endurance exercises that pushed her beyond any limit she thought she had. But the worst wasn't the physical training. It was the mental training. Massacre forced her to confront each of the 35 voices individually, to hear their stories, to feel their deaths, to carry not just their souls, but their complete memories, their traumas, their regrets. Her mother, Vivian, who died trying to protect her children, who carried guilt for not being fast enough, strong enough. Her father, Edmund, who died without understanding why the king his family served for generations betrayed them, who carried confusion and betrayal like open wounds. Her twin sisters, Alara and Miriam, who were only 12 years old, who died frightened and calling for their mother, who didn't understand why this was happening to them. Damien, her baby brother, who was 7 years old and thought everything was a nightmare from which he'd wake, who still didn't fully comprehend the concept of death. Each voice had its own pain, its own trauma, its own way of coping with what had happened. And Seraphina had to learn to balance all of them, while also maintaining her own sanity intact. "You're doing it wrong," Massacre said 6 months after training began. Seraphina was on the cave floor, bleeding from a dozen small cuts from her latest combat session, the voices screaming 35 different opinions about her technique. "I'm doing exactly what you told me," she responded through gritted teeth. "No," Massacre said, circling her like a predator. "You're trying to please all of them, trying to do what each voice wants. That's impossible. They want contradictory things. So what should I do?" "Choose," he said simply. "You're the living one. You're the one in control. The voices can advise, can warn, can share their experiences. But in the end, you decide, not them." Seraphina looked at him with eyes that glowed with light from dead galaxies. "And if I choose wrong?" "Then you live with the consequences," Massacre responded, "as we all do." He extended his hand to help her up. "But at least they'll be your choices, your revenge, your path, not theirs." Something changed in that moment. Seraphina stopped trying to please the voices, stopped trying to do what each one wanted. Instead, she began to hear them as advisors, as different perspectives on the same situation. And slowly, painfully, she learned to synthesize their opinions into decisions that were uniquely hers. The second year of training focused on something different: magic. Specifically, the shadow magic that Guardians use to maintain the seals. Massacre was brutally honest about what this meant. Guardians weren't shining heroes from fairy tales. They worked with darkness because it was darkness they needed to contain. Their powers came from seeing truths others couldn't, from facing corruption without blinking, from carrying the weight of secrets that could destroy kingdoms. And for a corrupted Guardian, someone who carried 35 souls beyond her own, the power was magnified, and so was the danger. "Every time you use shadow magic," Massacre explained, "you pay a price. For normal Guardians, the price is small: fatigue, headaches. Nothing permanent. But for you, carrying so many souls, the price is different." "What kind of price?" Seraphina asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "Memories," Massacre said. "Every time you channel power through the 35 souls, you burn a bit of them, lose fragments of who they were. And eventually, if you use too much, you'll consume them completely. They'll disappear, and you'll be alone again." Seraphina felt the voices react with fear. Her mother begged her not to risk it. Her father insisted the sacrifice might be necessary. Damien cried, not wanting to disappear. "So I need to choose," Seraphina said slowly, "between enough power to renew the seals and save the kingdom, or preserve my family's souls." "Exactly," Massacre confirmed. "And that choice is coming faster than you think." He was right. As the months passed, Seraphina could feel the seals deteriorating. It wasn't something she saw or heard. It was something deeper. A growing pressure at the back of her mind. As if something immense was pushing against a door that grew weaker each day. The shadow devourer was awakening, and it was hungry. Massacre taught her about the entity's true nature. It wasn't a demon in the traditional sense. It wasn't malevolent by choice or pleasure. It was more like a natural phenomenon, a black hole of consciousness that fed on certain emotions and energies. Corruption, lies, betrayal, innocent blood spilled by those in power. The more of these things existed in the kingdom, the stronger the shadow became. And when it became strong enough, it awakened and consumed everything. Why did Thornwick's founders build their palace over it? Seraphina asked during a particularly brutal training session. Why not simply avoid the area completely? Because they couldn't, Mallacar responded. The shadow doesn't stay in one place. It goes wherever there's power, wherever there's a throne, wherever decisions affecting thousands are made. It's drawn to centers of authority like moths to flames. The founders understood this. So instead of letting it wander freely, finding and consuming every small lord and village chief, they imprisoned it under the greatest center of power they had, and placed guardians to watch over it, to ensure the seals never failed. But the seals had failed, and there weren't enough guardians to renew them. Only Seraphina, a 19-year-old corrupted guardian carrying 35 fragmented souls and 3 years of brutal training, against an entity that had been imprisoned so long that entire civilizations had been born and died since then. The odds weren't good. You can't do this alone, Mallacar finally said, 2.5 years after Seraphina's arrival. Renewing the seals requires multiple guardians working in harmony. You have the souls of 35, but they're fragmented, traumatized, not in harmony. So what do I do? Seraphina asked, though she already knew she wouldn't like the answer. You have 2 options, Mallacar said, his voice heavy with something that might have been regret. First option. You go to the palace, expose the truth about the massacre, force the king to acknowledge what he did, and then you sacrifice yourself. Use all the energy of the 35 souls at once, burning them completely to renew the seals. You die. They disappear. But the kingdom survives. Seraphina felt the voices react. Some, like her mother, were willing to accept this sacrifice. Others, like her sisters, recoiled in horror. And what's the second option? Revenge, Mallacar said simply. You go to the palace. Kill everyone responsible for the massacre. The king, his advisor Gregor, every Crimson Fang who participated. You satisfy the voice's bloodlust, and then you let the seals fail completely. Let the shadow devourer awaken and consume the kingdom that killed your family. You survive. The voices survive. But everyone else dies. Seraphina was silent for a long time. The 35 voices argued fiercely. Her mother begged for mercy. Her father demanded appropriate justice. Her sisters wanted blood. Damien didn't fully understand, but was afraid of disappearing. Her uncle Marcus analyzed the options strategically. Her Aunt Helena saw betrayal in both paths. And she, Seraphina, the real person under all the voices, had to decide, not just for what would happen to her, but for the fate of thousands of innocent people who had nothing to do with her family's massacre. Is there a third option? She finally asked. Mallacar studied her with those empty silver eyes. There's always a third option. But it's usually the hardest. He stood, walking to the cave mouth where faint light filtered in. You go to the palace, expose the truth, force the king to face his crimes, and then you offer him a choice. He can help you renew the seals. Not as a guardian. He doesn't have the blood for that. But as an anchor. Someone willing to sacrifice part of his own life force to stabilize the magic while you work. Would that kill him? Probably, Mallacar admitted, or at least leave him permanently weakened. But it would split the cost. You wouldn't need to burn all 35 souls, just some, enough to complete the ritual. Seraphina processed this, so I'd still lose part of them. Yes, Mallacar confirmed, but not all. And the kingdom would survive. And you'd have your revenge in a different way. Forcing the king to live with what he did. forcing him to pay a real price for his crimes. Death is easy. Living with guilt is much harder. The third year of training was different. Massacre stopped teaching her to fight and began teaching her something much more important: how to renew the seals. It was incredibly complex magic. Required not just raw power, but precision, control, and above all, harmony between multiple energy sources working as one. For normal guardians, this meant multiple family members channeling together. For Seraphina, it meant making the 35 souls inside her work in perfect unison. Something they'd never managed to do, not even when they were alive. You need to make them agree, Massacre explained. Not about everything, but about this. About the importance of saving the kingdom. About being willing to sacrifice themselves, at least partially, for a greater good. How do I do that? Seraphina asked. They can't even agree on what to eat for breakfast. You remind them why the Umbravox exist, Massacre said. Not for power, not for prestige, but to protect. That's what guardians serve. To stand between the kingdom and the things that would destroy it. Even when the kingdom doesn't deserve protection. Even when the kingdom betrayed them. Because in the end, it's not about the kingdom. It's about the innocent people who live in it. The children who had nothing to do with king's decisions. The farmers who just want to grow their crops in peace. The merchants, the craftsmen, the ordinary families who'll be the first to die if the Shadow Devourer fully awakens. Seraphina spent months working on this, talking to each of the 35 voices individually, hearing their concerns, their fears, their desires for revenge, and slowly, patiently, convincing them there was a better way. Her mother was the easiest. Vivian had always been compassionate, had always put others before herself. She agreed immediately to sacrifice herself if it meant saving innocent lives. Her father took longer. Edmund was furious about the betrayal, wanted justice, wanted the king to pay. But he'd also been a guardian. He understood duty. Eventually he agreed, but only if Seraphina promised the king would face real consequences. Her sisters were the hardest. Alara and Miriam were only 12 when they died. They didn't understand abstract concepts like duty or greater good. They just knew they were dead, that they'd been murdered, and that they wanted someone to pay for it. Seraphina had to appeal to something simpler. "Do you want other children to feel what you felt?" she asked. "Want other sisters to watch their families die? Because that's what will happen if the shadow awakens. Thousands of children will die, exactly like you died." Slowly, reluctantly, the twins agreed. But Damien was the hardest of all. Damien was 7 years old. He didn't fully understand death, didn't understand sacrifice or duty or greater good. He just knew he was scared, that he wanted his mother, that he didn't want to disappear, and Seraphina couldn't blame him. How do you convince a 7-year-old child to accept ceasing to exist? "You don't convince," her mother's voice whispered in her mind. "You promise you'll take care of him. That if he needs to disappear, you'll carry his memories. That he won't be forgotten." So Seraphina did exactly that. She held Damien's presence in her mind, imagined him as the boy he'd been, and made a promise. "If you need to go, I promise I'll never forget you. Promise I'll tell your story. Promise the world will know Damien Umbravox existed, that he was brave, that he mattered. You won't disappear. You'll live through me." Damien's presence trembled, then slowly calmed. "Okay," he whispered in that child's voice that broke Seraphina's heart every time she heard it. "I trust you, Sarah. Just don't leave me alone." "Never," Seraphina promised, tears streaming down her face. "You'll never be alone. None of you will." And in that moment, something changed. The 35 voices, which had been in constant conflict for 3 years, finally reached something resembling harmony. Not perfect agreement, but shared understanding. Common purpose. They were Umbravox, and Umbravox protected, even when it hurt. Especially when it hurt. Massacre felt the change immediately. His empty silver eyes widened slightly, the only expression of surprise Seraphina had ever seen from him. "You did it," he said, something like admiration in his voice. 3 years. Most corrupted guardians go mad in months. But you didn't just survive. You unified them. Seraphina wiped the tears from her face. "So am I ready? For training?" "Yes," Massacre said, "but not for what comes after." He walked to her, placing a heavy hand on her shoulder. "When you go to the palace, when you confront the king and his advisor, you need to understand something. Gregor isn't what he seems." Seraphina frowned. "What do you mean?" "I saw him through the echoes. He's corrupt, yes, but still human." "No," Massacre said, his voice heavy with dark certainty. "He's not. I spent 60 years studying the seals, studying the Shadow Devourer, studying everything about the prison under the palace, and I discovered something the original Guardians either didn't know or chose not to record. The Shadow isn't just an entity. It's a consciousness. And consciousnesses can do things brute force can't." "Like what?" Seraphina asked, though she knew she wouldn't like the answer. "Like creating avatars," Massacre said. "Like separating small fragments of itself and planting them in human hosts. Like influencing events from outside its prison, preparing conditions for its eventual awakening." "You're saying Gregor is possessed by the Shadow Devourer?" "Worse," Massacre responded. "Gregor is the Shadow Devourer, or at least an extension of it. He probably doesn't even know it consciously, but everything he's done, every manipulation, every massacre he orchestrated, was designed for one purpose: break the seals, eliminate the Guardians, and create you." Seraphina felt ice run through her veins. "Create me? Why?" "Because you're the perfect key," Massacre explained. "A corrupted guardian carrying 35 souls. You have enough power to renew the seals from within. But you also have enough power to destroy them completely from within. It depends on how that power is directed. And if Gregor can manipulate you at the critical moment, if he can make you channel your energy the wrong way, you won't renew the seals. You'll shatter them permanently, and the Shadow Devourer will be free." The 35 voices exploded in panic. Her mother screamed warnings. Her father demanded she reconsider going to the palace. Her sisters wanted to flee. Damien cried with fear, and Seraphina, at the center of it all, forced herself to stay calm. "So what do I do?" she asked. "How do I renew the seals without falling into his trap?" "You need an anchor," Massacre said. "Someone outside you who can stabilize the magic. Someone not connected to the shadow. Someone willing to sacrifice everything to correct their mistakes." "The king," Seraphina realized. "You're saying I need Shadow King Aldrich to help me voluntarily, a man who ordered my entire family's massacre." "Yes," Massacre confirmed. "And that's the hardest part, because you'll have to convince him not through threats or violence, but through truth. You'll have to make him see what he really did, what he became, and what he needs to do to have any chance of redemption." The last 6 months of training focused on practical preparation. Massacre used his 60 years of knowledge to teach Seraphina everything about the palace, its layout, its defenses, the guard patrol patterns, the secret passages only the royal family knew. And most importantly, the exact location of the seal chamber beneath the throne room. But he also taught her something more subtle. Politics, how to speak to nobles, how to present evidence in a way that couldn't be ignored, how to use truth as a weapon more effective than any sword. "You can't just storm in and start killing people," Massacre explained. "Well, you can. You have the power for it. But then you become exactly the monster they say you are, and no one will help you renew the seals. They'll just try to kill you." "So what do I do?" Seraphina asked. "You force them to listen," Mallacar said. You choose your moment carefully, a public ceremony where all the important nobles are gathered. You reveal yourself. You present evidence of what really happened. And you give the king a choice in front of his entire court. Admit his crimes and help you save the kingdom, or deny everything and watch while the shadow devourer consumes everything he claims to rule. He'll choose to save the kingdom, Seraphina said, not as a question, but as a statement. How do you know? Mallacar asked, curious. Because I saw him through the echoes, Seraphina responded. Saw the man he was on the night of the massacre. Young, frightened, manipulated by Gregor. He believed he was protecting his kingdom from a supernatural threat. He was wrong, terribly wrong, but his intentions weren't malevolent. And in the 3 years since, he's been tormented by nightmares, by guilt, by doubt. She looked at Mallacar with eyes that contained galaxies. He wants redemption. He just doesn't know how to get it. And I'm going to show him. 3 years after the massacre, Seraphina was ready. Her body was lean and muscular from years of brutal training. Her hands were calloused from weapon work. Her feet were quick from countless evasion exercises. And her mind, though still housing 35 voices beyond her own, had learned to orchestrate them into something resembling harmony. She was no longer the broken girl who'd fled the ruins. She was something new, something the kingdom hadn't seen in 60 years. A corrupted guardian in full power. And she was going home. Mallacar accompanied her to the edge of the Forgotten Lands. He didn't say much. He wasn't a man for emotional speeches or sentimental farewells. But when Seraphina was about to leave, he spoke. I failed, he said simply. 60 years ago, when my family was massacred, I survived, trained, became strong, and when I finally had the chance to make a difference, I hesitated. Let that era's king die of natural causes instead of forcing him to face his crimes. And for 60 years, I've lived with that regret. He looked at her with those empty silver eyes. Don't make my mistake. When it's time to act, don't hesitate. Do what needs to be done, even if it hurts. Especially if it hurts. Seraphina nodded slowly. And if I fail, if Gregor manipulates me and I end up destroying the seals instead of renewing them, then the kingdom falls, Mallacar said bluntly. And the shadow devourer consumes everything. Millions die, and you live with that for the rest of your life, however short it may be. He placed a hand on her shoulder. But you won't fail. You know why? Because you have something I never had. 35 people who love you enough to sacrifice themselves for you. Use that. Let their love be your anchor when the darkness tries to pull you down. The journey back to the capital took 5 days. Seraphina traveled in disguise, just another refugee among many on the kingdom's roads. She used herbs Mallacar had given her to make her silver eyes a common muddy brown, kept her white hair hidden under a hood, and moved with the kind of anonymity only the truly desperate can achieve. No one looked twice at her, but she looked at everything. And what she saw filled her with growing urgency. The kingdom was getting worse. Not in obvious ways. There were no plagues or famines or wars, but there was something more subtle, a rot setting in. She saw it in people's eyes, a growing distrust. Neighbors looking at each other with suspicion, merchants cheating customers more frequently, guards accepting bribes openly, small corruption spreading like mold. And she felt it. The pressure at the back of her mind getting stronger with every kilometer she approached the capital. The shadow devourer was awakening, and its mere presence, even still imprisoned, was beginning to infect the kingdom. Corruption called to corruption. Lies bred more lies. Betrayal fed on betrayal. If the seals weren't renewed soon, it wouldn't matter if the shadow physically escaped or not. It would already be destroying the kingdom from the inside out. Seraphina arrived at the capital on the eve of the blood moon ceremony. It was the most important social event of the year, when all the important nobles gathered at the palace to celebrate the kingdom's founding. 500 lords and ladies in their finest clothes, 100 elite guards in ceremonial armor. And at the center of it all, Shadow King Aldrich on his obsidian throne, presiding over a kingdom that didn't know it was on the verge of collapse. Perfect, her Uncle Marcus's voice whispered in her mind. Maximum visibility, maximum public pressure. He won't be able to deny or hide the truth with so many witnesses. Seraphina agreed. She'd spent the last 3 days in the capital gathering information, mapping the palace defenses, identifying potential allies, and discovering something interesting. Commander Vorath Thorn, the man who'd led the Crimson Fangs on the night of the massacre, was leaving coded messages in taverns throughout the city. Messages clearly meant for her: patrol routes, weak points in the defenses, times when certain areas would be less guarded. He was helping her. Why? Seraphina used her guardian eyes to examine the echoes around one of the taverns where Vorath had left messages, and saw the truth. Vorath was tormented. 3 years of nightmares. 3 years of seeing the faces of the children he'd helped kill. 3 years of knowing he'd followed monstrous orders without question. He couldn't undo what he'd done, but he could try to help the only survivor achieve some kind of justice. It was redemption through betrayal, and Seraphina would accept his help, even coming from the man who'd killed her family. The night of the blood moon ceremony arrived. The palace blazed with light from 1,000 torches. Music flowed from the upper halls. The smell of expensive food and even more expensive wine hung in the air. And Seraphina, disguised as a common servant, slipped through the outer defenses, using exactly the routes Vorath had provided. The 35 voices whispered constant guidance. Her mother advised her to be careful. Her father pointed out guards she needed to avoid. Her sisters watched for betrayals. Damien, strangely, was calm, as if he understood this was the moment everything had been building toward. Seraphina reached the service passages leading to the throne room. She could hear the celebration above. Laughter, conversations, the clinking of glasses. 500 nobles completely oblivious to the fact their world was about to be turned upside down. She checked the leather bag she carried. Inside were documents. Not the originals, those had burned with her home, but copies Malachar had preserved. Evidence of 60 years of conspiracy. Proof that the Guardians weren't dark magic practitioners, but protectors. Proof that the massacre had been based on lies. Proof that Gregor had manipulated 2 kings over decades. And most importantly, diagrams showing the exact location of the prison under the palace and the current state of the seals. Anyone with basic magical knowledge would be able to verify the information, would be able to sense the Shadow Devourer awakening, would be able to understand that Seraphina was telling the truth. Seraphina climbed the service stairs. Her hands didn't tremble. Her heart beat steady. The 35 voices had quieted in silent anticipation. This was the moment. 3 years of preparation. 3 years of pain and training and learning to live with a chorus of the dead in her head, all leading to this single moment. She reached the door leading to the throne room. She could hear King Aldrich speaking, his deep voice carrying through the gathered crowd. He was making a toast, something about unity and strength and the kingdom's bright future. Empty words from a man who didn't know his kingdom was built over a failing prison. Seraphina took a deep breath. Let the herb hiding her eyes dissipate. Felt her silver eyes begin to glow with their natural light. Galaxies of dead stars spinning in their depths. And then she pushed the door open and entered the throne room. The effect was immediate. The nearest conversation stopped. Heads turned. Someone screamed. And then, like a wave spreading through still water, silence spread through the hall, until 500 nobles were staring at the silver-eyed girl standing in the service entrance. Shadow King Aldrich froze, his wineglass halfway to his lips. His eyes, golden like all those of the royal line, widened with recognition and horror. He knew, even without ever having seen her before, he knew exactly who she was. "Seraphina Umbravox," she said, her voice carrying through the absolute silence. "Last of the Shadow Guardian lineage, sole survivor of the massacre you ordered 3 years ago. And I've come here tonight to offer you a choice, King Aldrich. A chance at redemption, or a death sentence for everything you claim to protect." Chaos exploded. Guards shouted orders. Nobles recoiled, some screaming, others frozen in shock. And from the corner of the hall, Seraphina saw Gregor move. The royal advisor, the man who'd served 3 generations of kings, the man who was secretly an avatar of the Shadow Devourer. His eyes met hers across the crowd, and for a moment, she saw his disguise falter, saw something ancient and hungry looking back at her through human eyes. He knew that she knew. And he was ready. "Guards!" Gregor shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Arrest her! She's the Umbravox witch, come to destroy us all." Exactly as the prophecy warned. 20 guards advanced, swords drawn. But before they could reach her, Seraphina did something no one expected. She didn't attack, didn't use magic, simply raised the leather bag above her head, where everyone could see. "I carry the truth," she said, her voice somehow amplified, carrying to every corner of the hall. "The truth about why my family was massacred. The truth about what really sleeps beneath this palace. The truth about the man who's been manipulating your kings for 60 years. She looked directly at Aldrich. "And the truth about what will happen to everyone in this hall if the seals aren't renewed in the next 48 hours. Aldrich slowly descended from his throne. His hand was on his sword, but he didn't draw it. His face was a mask of conflict, fear, guilt, curiosity, and something more. Hope. As if part of him had been waiting for this moment for 3 years. "What truth?" he asked, his voice low, but carrying through the silence. "That the prophecy was twisted," Seraphina responded. "That the guardians weren't dark magic practitioners, but protectors. That everything you were taught about my family was a lie. And that the man who taught you those lies," she pointed directly at Gregor, "isn't human. He's an extension of the very thing my family was charged with imprisoning. And he orchestrated the massacre specifically to break the seals and free his true self." Gregor laughed. It was a terrible sound. Too loud, too high-pitched, not completely human. "She's insane," he said, but his voice trembled. "Possessed by evil spirits. Don't listen to her lies." "Then prove their lies," Seraphina challenged. "Let the court mages examine these documents. Let them verify the state of the seals under the palace. Let them use truth detection magic on me. I'll submit to any test you want." She looked around the hall, making eye contact with as many nobles as possible. "Because I didn't come here to destroy. I came to save. But I can't do it alone. I need help. I need someone willing to admit terrible mistakes were made and work to correct them before it's too late." Silence. Then, from behind the crowd, a figure moved. Commander Vorath Thorn, leader of the Crimson Fangs, the man who'd led the massacre, walked forward. His face was pale, but determined. "She speaks the truth," he said, his voice rough. "I was there on the night of the massacre. I led the attack, and I saw things that didn't make sense. Saw the Umbravox trying to complete a ritual, not summon dark magic. Saw Advisor Gregor watching with satisfaction when we should have been preventing disaster. And I saw this girl," he pointed at Seraphina, trapped under her family's bodies, her eyes glowing with power that should have killed me, but didn't. Because guardians don't kill indiscriminately. They protect, even those who betrayed them. Vorath knelt. Not to Seraphina, but to Aldrich. "Majesty, I committed terrible crimes in your name, followed orders without question, and I've lived with that guilt for 3 years. If there's any chance at all, that we can correct what we did, I beg you to hear what she has to say." Aldrich looked at his commander, then at Gregor, who was becoming visibly agitated, then at Seraphina, standing calmly in the center of guards who didn't know if they should arrest her or protect her. And then he did something that shocked everyone present. He removed his crown. Slowly. Deliberately. The symbol of his authority, of his right to rule, set aside. "I dream of them every night," he said, his voice breaking. 35 people. I signed the execution order. I believed I was protecting my kingdom, and for 3 years, I've wondered if I made the biggest mistake of my life. He descended the throne steps, walking through the shocked crowd until he stood face to face with Seraphina. "If you can prove they were lies, if you can show there's a real threat that needs to be faced, then I'll help. I'll do whatever's necessary to correct my mistakes, even if it costs me everything." Seraphina studied him with her guardian eyes, saw through every layer of defense, every carefully constructed wall, straight to the core of the man, and saw truth. Aldrich wasn't malevolent. He was flawed, manipulated, frightened, but genuinely remorseful, and willing to pay any price for redemption. "Then listen," she said, opening the leather bag, "and learn what your advisor has been hiding from you for 3 generations." The next hours were the tensest in Thornwick's history. Seraphina presented evidence after evidence. Documents showing the 60-year conspiracy, diagrams of the prison under the palace, testimonies from Malachar, preserved in memory crystals the court mages confirmed were impossible to falsify. And then, the final proof. She led the court mages, Aldrich, and a dozen selected nobles to the seal chamber. Deep beneath the palace, in a room that hadn't been opened in 3 years, they saw the truth. The seals were failing. Cracks ran through the containment walls. Magical symbols that should glow with constant light flickered and died, and at the center of it all, they could feel it. Something immense, something hungry, something that was awakening. One of the mages, an elderly woman named Magistrate Ilara, fell to her knees. "By all the gods," she whispered, "it's real. Everything is real." She looked at Seraphina with new respect and horror. "How much time do we have?" 48 hours, Seraphina responded. "Maybe less. The seals are deteriorating faster now that the shadow senses it's close to freedom." "What do we need to do?" Aldrich asked, his voice firm despite the obvious fear in his eyes. "Renew the seals," Seraphina explained. "But I can't do it alone. Normally it would require multiple guardians working together. I have the souls of 35 inside me, but they're fragmented, traumatized. I need an external anchor, someone willing to channel life force to stabilize the magic while I work." She looked directly at Aldrich. "Someone willing to pay with blood for crimes committed." "Will it kill me?" Aldrich asked. "Probably not," Seraphina admitted. "But it will weaken you permanently. You'll never be the same again. You might lose years of your life, might lose part of your strength, your vitality. It's a high price." "Not as high as 35 innocent lives," Aldrich responded without hesitation. "I'll do it. When do we start?" "Not so fast," a voice echoed through the chamber. Gregor stood at the entrance, but he no longer looked human. His skin had become translucent, showing shadows moving beneath the surface. His eyes glowed with black light, and his voice, when he spoke, was multiple voices in horrible harmony. "Did you really think it would be that easy? That I'd allow decades of planning to be undone by a traumatized girl and a guilty king?" The temperature in the chamber plummeted. Everyone's breath became visible, and the walls began to bleed darkness. Not ink, not shadow, but pure absence. void that consumed light and heat and hope. Gregor, or the thing using his body, advanced. "I am the Shadow Devourer," he said, "or at least a fraction of it. Planted in this body 60 years ago, guiding events, manipulating kings, orchestrating massacres, all for this moment." He pointed at Seraphina. "And you, my dear corrupted guardian, are the final piece. You carry 35 souls, 35 sources of power. If I can make you channel that energy the right way, at the right moment, you won't renew the seals. You'll destroy them from within, and I'll finally be free." Seraphina felt the 35 voices explode in panic. But beneath the panic, she felt something else. Determination. Her mother reminding her why they'd agreed to sacrifice themselves. Her father reinforcing her resolve. Her sisters channeling their fear into focused anger. And Damien, his child's voice surprisingly calm, saying simply, "We trust you, Sarah. Do what needs to be done." "You're wrong about one thing," Seraphina said, her voice firm. "I'm not a piece in your game. I'm a guardian, and guardians don't break. We protect, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts." Her silver eyes exploded with light. Not the black light of the shadow, but something different. Pure silver. The combined power of 36 souls working in perfect harmony. And for the first time in 60 years, the Shadow Devourer felt something it had forgotten. Fear. What followed wasn't a battle in the traditional sense. It was a confrontation of wills. Gregor, or the Shadow's fraction using his body, launched waves of consuming darkness, tried to envelop Seraphina, drag her down, make her doubt and despair, and finally break. But Seraphina wasn't alone. She had 35 voices supporting her. 35 different perspectives on the same situation. 35 sources of strength when her own faltered. Her mother reminded her of love, her father of honor, her sisters of righteous anger, Damien of the innocence worth protecting. And she, Seraphina, the living one, the one in control, wove all these perspectives into something greater than the sum of its parts. Aldrich didn't stand idle. He might not have guardian blood, but he was a king. He had authority. He had willpower forged by 3 years of guilt and determination to do right. He placed himself between Seraphina and Gregor, his sword drawn, and when the darkness tried to pass through him, he cut it. Not with steel, but with pure conviction. The court mages joined in, Magistrate Alara channeling protective barriers, others casting light to push the shadows back. And Vorath, the commander who'd led the massacre, fought with a ferocity born of 3 years of regret. He couldn't undo what he'd done, but he could ensure it wouldn't be in vain. Slowly, step by step, they pushed Gregor back. Not defeating him, the shadow was too ancient, too powerful to be destroyed so easily, but containing him, keeping him away from Seraphina while she worked. Because while the battle raged, Seraphina was doing something much more important. She was renewing the seals. It was the most complex magic she'd ever attempted. Required her to channel power through the 35 souls inside her, weaving their energies into patterns developed over centuries. Required perfect precision. One mistake, and she could do exactly what the shadow wanted, shatter the seals instead of renewing them. But she wasn't alone. Aldrich, true to his word, had offered himself as anchor. He knelt in the center of the seal circle, his hands pressed against the ground, and let Seraphina pull from his life force. She could feel it. Every year she took from him. Every fraction of vitality she burned to stabilize the magic. He was aging before her eyes, hair darkening to gray, lines deepening in his face, but he didn't falter, didn't pull back, just held his position and let her take what she needed, and the 35 souls inside Seraphina paid their own price. One by one she felt parts of them burn, not completely, not disappearing entirely, but fragments of who they'd been, sacrificed to fuel the magic. Her mother lost memories of her youth. Her father lost recollections of military victories. Her sisters lost moments of childhood. And Damien, her baby brother, lost his fear. Not because it was burned, but because he chose to let it go. Chose to be brave so Seraphina wouldn't have to carry his terror along with everything else. The seals began to glow, not with the faint flickering light of failing magic, but with steady, strong brilliance of renewed containment. The cracks in the walls began to close. The symbols that had gone dark lit up again. And deep below, the shadow devourer felt its chains tighten, felt the prison it had nearly escaped become solid again, and roared with rage that made the very earth tremble. Gregor, or what remained of him, screamed, not with human voice, but with the sound of 1,000 voices in agony. His body began to dissolve, the shadow's fraction being pulled back into the main prison. "You haven't won!" he spat as he dissolved. "This is just a delay. The seals will fail again, and next time, there won't be guardians to renew them." "You're wrong," Seraphina said, her voice echoing with power from 36 souls. "Because I'm still here. And as long as I live, as long as these 35 souls live through me, the guardians aren't extinct. We survived, and will continue surviving and protecting, no matter the cost." The last fraction of Gregor disappeared with a scream that echoed across dimensions. And then, finally, silence. The seals were renewed. The shadow devourer was imprisoned again. And Seraphina Umbravox, last of the guardians, fell to her knees, exhausted beyond anything she'd ever felt, but alive and victorious. Aldrich collapsed beside her. He looked like he'd aged 20 years. His hair was completely gray now. His face was marked with deep lines. His hands trembled with weakness that would never completely leave him. But he was smiling. A small, tired smile of a man who'd finally found redemption. "It worked," he whispered. "We did it." "We did," Seraphina agreed, but the cost was high. She could feel the 35 voices inside her, still present, but weaker. Parts of them burned forever. They'd paid the price of saving the kingdom, and she'd carry that weight for the rest of her life. Vorath approached, his face marked with cuts from fighting Gregor's darkness. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," Aldrich said, forcing himself to stand with Magistrate Alara's help. "Now we face the truth. All of it." He looked at Seraphina. "You exposed my crimes before my court. I killed your family based on lies. That's a fact that can't be denied or hidden. So what will you do?" "Justice," Aldrich responded. "Real justice. Not the farce Gregor orchestrated, but real accountability." He took a deep breath. "I'll convene the Council of Lords, present all the evidence, admit my crimes publicly, and submit to whatever punishment they deem appropriate, even if it means abdicating the throne, even if it means execution." Seraphina studied him with her guardian eyes, saw sincerity, saw a man willing to pay any price for his mistakes, and felt the 35 voices inside her react. Her mother whispered forgiveness. Her father demanded justice, but justice tempered with mercy. Her sisters were satisfied the truth would finally be known. And Damien, his child's voice, said simply, "He tried to fix it. That counts for something, doesn't it?" 3 months later, Seraphina stood in the same throne room where everything had culminated. But circumstances were very different. The Council of Lords had convened. Evidence had been presented, witnesses had spoken, and a verdict had been reached. Aldrich wouldn't be executed, but he also wouldn't remain king. He would abdicate in favor of a regency council until an appropriate successor could be determined. Would spend the rest of his life in service to the kingdom, not as ruler, but as advisor. Using his experience to guide, but never again having final authority. It was a punishment that would force him to live with his choices. to see the consequences, to work every day to be better than he'd been. And Seraphina, after much debate, had been appointed official guardian of the kingdom, not just of the seals, though that was her primary responsibility, but as a check against corruption. Her eyes that saw through lies would be used to examine important decisions, to ensure the kingdom was never again manipulated by dark forces. Vorath had been spared execution, but removed from his command. He now led a new order, sworn guardians, warriors dedicated to protecting Seraphina and helping her in her duties. It was redemption through service, and he accepted it with gratitude. But not everything was perfect. The 35 voices inside Seraphina were weaker now. Parts of them had been permanently burned to renew the seals. She still heard them, still felt their presences, but they were slowly fading. In decades, maybe less, they'd disappear completely, and Seraphina would be alone again. She was standing on the palace balcony, looking at the city below, when she felt a familiar presence at her side. Massacre had left the Forgotten Lands for the first time in 60 years to witness the verdict. "You did well," he said simply. "Better than I did." "I couldn't have done it without you," Seraphina responded. "Without your training, your knowledge. You gave me the tools to survive." "I gave tools," Massacre agreed. "But you chose how to use them, chose protection instead of revenge, chose sacrifice instead of destruction. Those were your choices, not mine." He looked at the city with silver eyes that finally contained something beyond emptiness. Hope. The Guardians aren't extinct. As long as you live, as long as you carry those 35 souls, our order survives. And perhaps, eventually, others with Guardian blood will emerge. Hidden lineages like the king's mother. And you can train them. Pass forward what you learned. Seraphina nodded slowly. "How long will the seals last?" 60 years, Massacre responded. "Maybe 70 if you maintain them well. So you'll have time. Time to find other guardians. Time to rebuild what was lost. Time to ensure that when you finally depart, you don't leave the kingdom defenseless." They stood in silence for a long moment. Two corrupted guardians looking at a kingdom they'd saved at terrible cost. Then Massacre spoke again, his voice softer. "The voices are fading, aren't they?" Seraphina didn't ask how he knew. Slowly. Parts of them burned to renew the seals. "In a few decades, they'll be completely gone. I'll be alone." "You'll never be alone," Massacre said. "They'll live through you. Through your memories. Through the choices you make. Through how you live your life. That's what it means to be a guardian. To carry those who came before. To honor their sacrifices. And to ensure their deaths had meaning." That night, Seraphina returned to the ruins of Umbravox Manor for the first time in 3 years. The site had been left untouched, an impromptu memorial for the 35 who died there. She walked through the ashes, her feet leaving footprints in the soot that still covered the ground, and spoke to the voices inside her. One last time while they were still strong enough to respond clearly. "Mother," she whispered, "I kept my promise. I showed them the truth. Not through revenge, but through sacrifice." Vivian's voice responded, faint but warm. "I'm so proud of you, my daughter. You became everything I hoped for and more." "Father," Seraphina continued, "I honored our duty, protected the kingdom, even when they didn't deserve protection." Edmund's voice carried approval. "You're a true guardian, better than I ever was." "Alara, Miriam," Seraphina said, addressing her sisters. "Justice was done. Not the way you wanted, perhaps, but in a way that means something." The twins' voices responded in unison. "We understand now. Thank you for not letting us become monsters." "And Damien," Seraphina said, her voice breaking. "My baby brother. You were so brave. braver than any 7-year-old should have to be. Damien's voice, always the clearest, always the most present, responded with that innocence that broke Seraphina's heart. It wasn't so bad, Sarah. I had you, and you took care of me, like you promised. Tears streamed down Seraphina's face now. I'll miss you, all of you, when you finally fade. We'll never really fade, all 35 voices responded in harmony. We'll live through you, through every choice you make, every person you protect, every time you choose light instead of darkness. We'll be there, always. Seraphina spent the night in the ruins, surrounded by her family's ghosts, and when dawn came, she rose, wiped her tears, and walked back to the capital, back to her duties as guardian, back to the work of protecting a kingdom that had tried to destroy her. Because that's what guardians did. Not because it was easy, not because it was fair, but because it was necessary, and because some things were worth protecting, even at the cost of everything. The following years weren't easy. Seraphina faced resistance from nobles who didn't trust her, faced threats from factions wanting to return to the old ways, faced the slow pain of feeling the 35 voices gradually disappear, fragment by fragment, until only echoes remained. But she also saw changes, saw the kingdom slowly become better, saw corruption being exposed and punished, saw laws being passed to protect the vulnerable, saw a new generation growing up who knew the truth about the guardians and honored them instead of fearing them. And eventually, she found others. People with traces of guardian blood. Not strong enough to renew the seals alone, but strong enough to be trained, to learn, to eventually become the next generation of protectors. Seraphina trained them as Massacre had trained her. With harshness, yes, but also with compassion. Taught them not just to fight, but to think, to question, to choose protection instead of power. And when the seals needed to be renewed again, 60 years later, she wasn't alone. There were 5 new guardians at her side. Young and inexperienced, yes, but dedicated. And together, they renewed the seals. Without sacrifice this time. Without burning souls or years of life. Just 6 guardians working in harmony, as it should be. Seraphina lived to 82 years old, a long life for someone who carried so much trauma, so much power, so much weight. And when her time finally came, she was surrounded by those she'd trained, by a kingdom that had learned to honor her, and by the memories of 35 voices that had long since faded but were never forgotten. Her last words, whispered to her gathered students, were simple. Protect them, not because they deserve it, but because it's the right thing to do, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. And then Seraphina Umbravox, last survivor of the massacre, first corrupted guardian in 60 years, savior of the kingdom, closed her silver eyes for the last time. But her story didn't end. Because stories of sacrifice, of choosing protection instead of revenge, of finding light, even in the deepest darkness, these stories never really end. They echo through generations, inspire others, become legends that shape how people think about duty and honor and what it truly means to protect something. And somewhere, in a place beyond life and death, 35 voices finally rested in peace, knowing their sacrifice wasn't in vain, that their niece, their daughter, their sister, had transformed their tragedy into something meaningful, had saved millions, had changed a kingdom, had proven that even from the deepest darkness, light could emerge, if someone was brave enough to choose it. And that, in the end, was the true lesson. Not about power or magic, or ancient entities imprisoned under palaces, but about choices, about deciding, moment by moment, what kind of person you want to be, what kind of legacy you want to leave, and whether you'll choose darkness or light when both are equally available. Seraphina chose light, and the kingdom was better for it.